بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي اللهم علمنا ما ينفعنا وانفعنا بما علمتنا وزدنا علما. In our last lesson we spoke about how in the year 33 after Isa alayhi salam, when Isa alayhi salam was 33 years old, how the Jews of Jerusalem collaborated with the Romans in an attempt to kill Isa alayhi salam. The Jews wanted to get rid of him for their own reasons, and they convinced the Romans that he was a threat to their rule. So the Jews collaborated with the Romans, and the Romans, they went to Jerusalem, they went house to house looking for Isa alayhi salam with the intention of capturing him and eventually executing him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala informed Isa alayhi salam about this plot. So as these Romans were coming from door to door, house to house in Jerusalem looking for Isa alayhi salam was actually in one of those homes in Jerusalem, and he was with his Hawariyeen, he was with his disciples. And he told his disciples, or he gave an offer to his disciples. He said, whoever amongst you volunteers to have my likeness placed upon him, these enemies are going to come and they're going to see you and they're going to think that you are me, and they will capture you and they will kill you. Whoever volunteers to have my likeness placed on him, and then this will happen to him, this person will be with me in Jannah. So the youngest of those Hawariyeen, the youngest of those disciples, he volunteered. And Isa alayhi salam, seeing the youth, or seeing how young this man was, he was hoping that maybe someone else would volunteer instead. So he asked again, but it was that young man who persisted and insisted that he wants to be the one to have this honor. So in the end, Isa alayhi salam accepted it from him, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala placed the image, the likeness of Isa alayhi salam upon the face of this young man. And as for Isa alayhi salam, he was taken into the heavens. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lifted him up and he left this earth. So when the Romans came to that house and they saw inside and they saw who they thought was Isa alayhi salam, but of course it actually wasn't him. They thought that it was him, they captured him and they executed him, they crucified him. So now Isa alayhi salam, he was saved from the plot of these people. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala saved him and lifted him up. But the people, they thought that Isa alayhi salam was dead. The people, they thought that Isa alayhi salam is dead. But the actuality, as we know, is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala lifted him into heaven. After Isa alayhi salam left this earth, then those who remained from amongst his followers, they were subjected to great oppression by the Jews. The Jews, they're the ones who wanted to get rid of Isa alayhi salam, and they wanted to get rid of his followers as well. So after Isa alayhi salam was lifted up, then the Jews, they started to mistreat and oppress those who remained in Jerusalem from the followers of Isa alayhi salam. So a number of the followers of Isa alayhi salam had to actually go into hiding, because if the Jews would find them, they would actually kill them. So a number of them went into hiding within Palestine, and a number of them actually fled Palestine. They had to leave Palestine, and a number of them actually ended up going to Rome in Italy. And that was the capital of the Roman Empire. So those who fled to Rome, they started to preach Christianity secretly in Rome. And of course, the Roman Empire, it was led by a polytheistic emperor. The Romans, they believed in a lot of false gods, and they were people of polytheism. So these Christians who fled to Rome, they started preaching Christianity secretly in Rome. They couldn't do it publicly, because if they would do it publicly, they would get arrested and they would likely be killed. So they were preaching Christianity secretly in Rome. Now back in Palestine, back in Jerusalem, the Jews, they were searching for any followers of Isa alayhi salam. If there's anyone who is still upon the way of Isa alayhi salam, they wanted to capture these people and they wanted to kill them. They wanted to make the followers of Isa alayhi salam extinct. Right? They wanted to get rid of any legacy that Isa alayhi salam left behind. So they would actually search for his followers. If they would find anyone, they would actually execute them. That's how bad the situation had become for the followers of Isa alayhi salam in Palestine. So a number of them remained in Palestine in hiding, while others, they fled Palestine and they went to Rome. Alright, so about 3 years after this, in the year 36, the emperor of Rome allowed the Jews of Jerusalem to once again practice self-rule. Of course, they were still under the umbrella of the Roman Empire. They were not completely independent, but the emperor decided to give them some semi-independence, that you can rule yourself. You don't need a Roman governor to oversee you anymore. You can rule yourself, but the condition is that you have to pay taxes to Rome. So we'll leave you alone. You can, live the life that you want to live, however you want to live. We're not going to interfere in your affairs, but you have to pay taxes to Rome because you are still under the Roman Empire. Alright, now those Christians who secretly remained in Jerusalem, they would also try to propagate their religion secretly. Right? Those who fled to Rome, they were propagating Christianity secretly in Rome, and those who remained in Jerusalem, they were secretly trying to propagate Christianity in Jerusalem. And if the Jews would come to know that there's any Christian preaching Christianity, they would capture that person and they would have that person killed. Right? So the tensions between the Jews and the Christians in Palestine, they continued to rise. Now, from amongst the most prominent Christians who fled Palestine and went to Rome were Peter and Paul. And I'm sure those of you who have some background knowledge of Christianity, you've heard these names, Peter and Paul. So they were from those who fled Palestine and actually relocated into Rome. And they were secretly trying to propagate and spread Christianity in Rome. Now, Paul introduced a lot of innovations into Christianity. Paul, he introduced a lot of philosophy into Christian thought. And he introduced a lot of innovative and heretical beliefs into Christianity. For example, the idea that Isa alayhi salam is the son of Allah, wal-iyadhu billah, that was never taught by Isa alayhi salam. He never claimed to be Allah. He never claimed to be the son of Allah. Rather, what he preached to the people was Inna Allah Rabbi wa Rabbukum fa'buduh. Hadha siratun mustaqim. Surely Allah is my Lord and your Lord, so worship Him. This is the straight path. This was what Isa alayhi salam preached. Just like all of the prophets before him preached the same message. Worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone. Do not associate partners with Him. Allah has no partner. He has no associate. He has no son. Lam yalid wa lam yulad. He does not beget, nor was he begotten. Right? This was the message that all of the prophets preached, including Isa alayhi salam. So Isa alayhi salam never claimed to be Allah. He never claimed to be the son of Allah. He never called to the worship of himself. He never called to the worship of his mother. None of these were from the teachings of Isa alayhi salam. But Paul is the one who introduced these things, these heretical beliefs into Christianity. So he distorted the true beliefs of Isa alayhi salam. So the religion that Christians follow today, modern Christianity, it is not the religion of Jesus. It is not the religion of Isa alayhi salam. Rather, it is the religion of Paul. The beliefs that the Christians have, they are beliefs that were introduced into the religion by Paul. So Paul altered the religion and he actually introduced shirk. He introduced shirk into Christianity. Wal-iyadhu billah. And it was easy for him to do this. The reason why it was so easy for him to do it was because the Injil, which was the revelation that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gave to Isa alayhi salam, the Injil had not been written down during the time of Isa alayhi salam. It was not written down. It was not in a book form. right? It was not collected into a book. So Paul and others were able to introduce their own falsehoods into the religion, and people would not be able to say anything because they would not have a source to go back to compare it with. Paul is saying this and that, okay, let's go back to the source and see. But they didn't have the source. They didn't have the Injil written down. So because of that, Paul and others were easily able to introduce falsehoods and distortions into the pure religion that Isa alayhi salam came down with, right? Alright, so the emperor of Rome, eventually he came to know that Peter and Paul were secretly preaching this new religion in Rome. And the emperor of the Roman Empire at that time, he was a man named Nero. So when he came to know that Peter and Paul were preaching this new religion, their version of Christianity in Rome, he ordered for these men to be found and captured. So eventually they were found. Peter and Paul were both found and they were captured. And when they were captured, Nero ordered for both of them to be executed. So Peter and Paul were actually executed by the orders of Nero, the Roman emperor. Alright. But they were able, before they were executed, they were able to amass somewhat of a following. So there were people now in Rome who were upon the way of Peter and Paul, even after Peter and Paul were executed. So these followers of Peter and Paul, they continued to try to spread Christianity in Rome. Now, as we mentioned, the Romans, they were polytheists. And they had lots of statues and idols that they used to worship. So the followers of Peter and Paul, they became influenced by the polytheistic religion of the Romans. So they're trying to preach Christianity, but at the same time, they're being influenced by the Roman religion themselves. So they saw all of these statues. Oh, these Romans, they have this statue of Jupiter and this statue of Saturn and these other false gods that they used to worship. And the Christians, they became impressed with that. Wow, they thought this is amazing. They said, we should do this too. So they started making statues as well. They introduced statues into Christianity, statues of Isa alayhi salam, statues of Maryam alayha as-salam, right? And they started worshipping those statues. So look how they distorted the pure religion that Isa alayhi salam came with, the religion of Tawheed. Look at how these people damaged it and distorted it in such a way. Alright. Now, going a few decades later, in the year 66 after Isa alayhi salam, the Jews in Jerusalem decided to revolt against the Romans. So up to this time, the Jews, they were allowed to have some semi-independence in Palestine. They were able to self-rule, but they were still under the umbrella of the Roman Empire, and they had to pay taxes to the Roman Empire. Right? So they got sick of paying the taxes. They wanted to stop paying the taxes, and they wanted complete independence from the Roman Empire. They were not happy with this semi-independence and self-rule. Rather, they wanted complete independence from the Roman Empire. So in the year 66, they staged a revolt against the Romans. So when they staged this revolt against the Romans, the emperor of the Roman Empire ordered for a siege of Jerusalem. He ordered for the Roman troops to surround Jerusalem and to take Jerusalem from the Jews. Now this siege lasted much longer than the Romans expected. The Romans thought that they could easily take Jerusalem from the Jews. But the siege lasted for 4 years. So the Jews, they actually put up a pretty strong fight. And this is something that actually damaged the reputation of the Roman Empire in the eyes of the world. Like, look, 4 years and they couldn't take the city from the Jews. The Roman Empire, they're supposed to be such a powerful empire, but it took them 4 years to take Jerusalem from the Jews, right? So this is something that really damaged the reputation of the Roman Empire in the eyes of the world. So 4 years later, in the year 70 after Isa alayhi salam, the Roman commander Titus was finally able to enter Jerusalem. And when he entered Jerusalem after 4 years, the Romans, they were really angry. And they were very upset that their reputation had been compromised. So they entered the city and they destroyed the city completely. They destroyed Jerusalem, all of the, the places of worship and all of the structures that the Jews had built in the city. They destroyed everything. right? They basically razed the city to the ground. And they appointed a Roman governor for Jerusalem. So they said, no more of this self-rule. Now you're going to be ruled by a Roman. They appointed a Roman governor for Jerusalem. And they took the Jews as captives and prisoners, and they took many of them to Rome. They actually took Jews as prisoners of war, and they took them back to Rome, and they sold them into slavery. They sold them as slaves in Rome. They said, you people, you're going to be our slaves in Rome. So this is actually how the Jews ended up in Europe, right? Even up to modern times, there are many Jews in Europe, and this is the reason why they actually came to Europe. They were taken as slaves by the Romans, and they were taken to Rome and sold into slavery, and from there, they were spread throughout Europe, right? And that's the background of the Jewish presence in Europe. All right, so they were taken to Rome, sold into slavery over there. Some of them remained in Palestine, some of them remained in Jerusalem, but they had to remain in hiding. They had to remain in hiding. All right, so that was the year 70 after Isa alayhi salam. About 60 years later, in the year 132 after Isa alayhi salam, those Jews who remained in Palestine and Jerusalem, they reorganized themselves and they decided to try once again to revolt against the Romans. So they organized themselves under a Jewish commander named Simon Bar Kokhba. He was the Jewish commander, and the Jews organized behind him and they revolted against the Romans. This is the year 132 after Isa alayhi salam. This war lasted for 3 years. This war where the Jews revolted against the Romans, this war actually lasted for 3 years, but once again, after 3 years, the Romans were able to gain the upper hand, and they took Jerusalem once again, and they destroyed the city once again. Once again, they razed the city to the ground, they destroyed the city, and this time they decided to rebuild Jerusalem again from scratch. The Romans, they said, we're going to rebuild the city ourselves, and we're going to build it as a Roman city now. So they wanted to put their own structures, they wanted to make their own places of worship for their idols, right? So they basically wanted Jerusalem to become a Roman city with no Jewish influence. So they destroyed all of the Jewish buildings, they destroyed the Jewish temples, right? The places of worship, they razed all of those to the ground, and they rebuilt the city from the ground up, and they did it as a Roman city. At that time, the Roman emperor, he was a man named Hadrian, and he renamed the city. Actually, the city became known from that time as Aelia, the city of Aelia. And he built a castle upon the ruins of some of the Jewish structures. They destroyed those Jewish structures, and Hadrian, he built a castle for himself there, right? And that area later on became known as Khirb al-Yahud, the ruins of the Jews. The place where he built that castle, it became known as the ruins of the Jews, because their structures were destroyed in order to make room for that castle. He also built a big temple in Jerusalem, and they're calling the city Aelia. He built a huge temple dedicated to Jupiter. Jupiter is one of the false gods that the Romans would worship, right? So they built a big temple that they dedicated to Jupiter there as well, right? And they also made an order. After all of these revolts, after all of these numerous revolts of the Jews against the Romans, they decided to make a rule that no Jew is allowed in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is off limits to the Jews. You tried to revolt against us so many times. Now, we don't want to deal with this anymore. No more Jews are allowed in Jerusalem. So the Roman emperor, he made this decision, and he made this order. No Jew is allowed in Jerusalem, in Aelia. And this prevention of Jews from entering Jerusalem, it lasted for 200 years. So no Jew was allowed to even enter Jerusalem for any reason for a period of 200 years. So that lasted from about the year 135 after Isa alayhi salam all the way to 324 after Isa alayhi salam. So close to 200 years, no Jew was allowed in Jerusalem. So the Jewish presence in Jerusalem was completely obliterated. And those 200 years, the historians, they say that those 200 years were known as actually quite peaceful years in Jerusalem. Right? No Jewish presence in Jerusalem, so it was pretty peaceful for those 200 years. All right. Now in the year 324 in Rome, at that time the emperor was a man named Constantine. And Constantine, he was very much into philosophy. He would study different religions as well. And with his study of religions and specifically Christianity, he decided in the year 324 to convert into Christianity. This is the Roman Emperor Constantine. In the year 324, he decided to become a Christian. Of course, the version of Christianity that he accepted, it was not the true religion of Isa alayhi salam, right? Rather, it was the altered and distorted version of Christianity that was made prominent through Paul, right? So Constantine, he decides to become a Christian. Now this was a big deal. The emperor of Rome is changing his religion. He's becoming a Christian. The head of the Roman Empire changing his religion and adopting Christianity, it would have a huge impact on Rome and its territories, right? So this was a big decision that was made by Constantine. He became a Christian, and inshallah next week we'll talk about the events that occurred after Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the effects that that had on the Roman Empire and the territories that were under the Roman Empire. We'll talk about that next week بإذن جزاكم الله خيرا وبارك الله فيكم وصلى الله وسلم وبارك على نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين.